Terry, you brought friends today? Friend?
Yeah, you've got to tell me one of these days you're going to share the secrets on the intro and outro tunes.
You're gonna be so underwhelmed if I ever tell you. That's why I keep it a secret. Sometimes I throw random stuff in there. If I show up one day and I've got a penny whistle for the intro music, don't be surprised. It'll be 99% secret sauce electronic thing, 0.5% guitar, and 0.5% penny whistle, just to keep it weird.
I'm going to pretend that I know what a penny whistle is.
It's a whistle that costs a penny.
Oh. Well, so we're talking music. We have John Lipinski with us today. I see a collection of guitars, John. Are you gonna play with us?
No, absolutely, absolutely not. I need a luthier. That's what I would like for Christmas. The intonations off on all those. So, I noodle around. That's about my chief musical contribution to the world. So
Is
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, the dark blue electric guitar. Is that an Ibanez?
That's an Ibanez back from the '90s, and that was actually like my first real guitar. So got that at some point in high school. I played in a band in college, and then just kind of put it aside for a while. But then in the last probably 10 years, picked it up. So I'm back to my old noodling self.
So we're gonna park that for 30 seconds so I can do a proper introduction, and then I've got questions about the Ibanez guitar.
I don't know if I'll have answers, but I'll give it a shot.
I think there's an Iron Maiden T-shirt in your closet somewhere.
There is an Iron Maiden T-shirt in my son's closet though, and I did go see Iron Maiden a couple of years ago in Cincinnati, and it was a thoroughly entertaining show. It was preposterous. It was half Spinal Tap, half opera. I don't know how they managed to do it. We also caught one of the drum skins at the tail end of it. They threw it out, and it came to me just like a bad frisbee throw, and I snagged it. And my son was delighted. He plays drums, and so that's a show of a lifetime. It was great.
How cool! So
great.
Russ, we have John Lipinski. John is he's a PhD in cognitive psychology, and made his way as a lot of quantitative people do, made his way to data science. Interesting story of how John and I connected, and I'll do this briefly. I was looking to learn a new package in R, the programming language R. This was, I don't know what, John, 5 years ago, maybe?
Yeah, probably 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. And I can't remember if it was Upwork or one of the gig sites. And I found John, we met. We're more interested in having conversations. He did teach me a thing or two in R. We collaborated on a little proof of concept for a manufacturer, an automotive manufacturer in Ohio. And anyway, that's how we know John. So welcome, John.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. So Ibanez guitar, probably a big metal fan in high school, I would assume.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was a big metal fan, but I'm sort of weirdly picky. So, for example, let's take it 7th grade, and I started listening to Metallica. So this would have been fairly early Metallica. I listened to Ride the Lightning and Master Puppets, and that was it. Only those 2 albums. I was really into Rat. I had 2 Rat albums. That was it. So I didn't listen to the full breadth of all the metal stuff. You know, I found a couple of albums that I just played over and over and over again. So and that lends itself to spending a lot of time in Europe. Listening to a lot of Randy Rhoads as well. Proudly still moved by everything he played. So that's one of the wonderful things about YouTube videos too. You can now dive in and see all sorts of things that you never had the opportunity to see or learn when you were younger.
Yeah, for sure. Did you regard the Nirvana entrance as a welcome respite, or did you bemoan the Nirvana entrance?
That's a good question. So I was a freshman in college when they exploded on the scene, if you will. I was never a huge Nirvana fan, although I understood what it was that they were pushing against. I mean, I listened to them a bunch, but it's not something that I put on now. I was more of the kind of the Smashing Pumpkins kind of guy. So, but in the back of my head, I'm still kind of a metal boy at heart. So there's been a resurgence of that, it seems. Not enough guitar solos in a lot of the current stuff. So that's kind of still where my heart lies, as immature as that may be.
Yeah, well, that's a question too, I guess. Well, let's pivot. Although we could take the whole time talking about music, and maybe we'll do that someday. But let's pivot. I wanna ask you a little bit generally about. So we're interested in. Um, I think the process of drawing firm conclusions for things that do not lend themselves for firm conclusions to be drawn.
Can I try and
And
translate that?
please.
Terry makes suppositions about society and culture, and I say, do you have a citation for that?
I have
That's
to.
good.
I was going to say, I have to give Russ credit. He's responsible for one of my biggest evolutions, especially probably ever, but especially the past few years, in that he asks, I make these wild generalizations, kids today or this thing or that thing. And he's like, well, compared to what, and what was the quantity of that thing back then? And what is it now? So we're constantly on some angle or some side of data to support or be the contrarian for a particular argument. So we're interested in that. Is that a good spot to be in, to be a consumer of psychology and social science studies generally?
I think it is. I think it's actually the right place. And I'll tell you why. I think, and we'll get into some of the replication crisis stuff, which has really been the top of people's minds for probably the last decade or so. But I think fundamentally psychology as a discipline, it's a little fuzzy. I think it's always going to be a little bit fuzzy just by its complex nature. People are messy. Societies are messy. But fundamentally, I think they're on the right path to asking the right questions. There is a need for stronger theory that gets to be very challenging. And as we'll talk about, I think a little bit later, you can see that need for theory popping up in a lot of the replication issues. I think undergirding a lot of those challenges was that people were attempting to publish papers just to get a publication and not necessarily trying to create a body of work that was moving toward a mature expression, a mature understanding of a given domain. But I think overall, as a field, it asks good core questions. It's not a coincidence that a lot of the questions that are still being asked, being asked in psychology, are actually questions that go back really as far as probably people and certainly the written word. You have a lot of the sort of recurring themes of what is life, what is memory, why are we here, what's the nature of relationships, myself to society, society to me, me to other individuals, family, etc., and what are the impacts of the societal relationships, familial relationships, how much is me, how much is coming externally. And I think the modern science of psychology, let's say, we'll pin it to the last 130, 40 years, I think it's done a good job of moving incrementally in that direction, providing better, clearer questions, and along the way, I think pulling along more sophisticated approaches. There are some challenges of that too, specifically in some of the statistical areas. We can talk about that a little bit later. But fundamentally, I think there's a good foundation, but there's a lot of things wrong in academic psychology specifically, and that has lent itself to doubts. And I think some of those doubts are well founded.
Yeah. When you mention problems in academic psychology, could you elaborate on a little bit? And maybe this will segue into like sort of the overlap between statistical challenges for replicating social science studies. But when you reference problems in academic psychology, what specifically are you referencing?
So I'll start at a very high level. Talking specific about the replication crisis, but I think in order to understand what that replication crisis is, I think it's important to take a step back, think about the incentives and the pressures that are operating for young academicians. I think it's not just in psychology, but and really across all the areas. But I think it's particularly strong in psychology. So at a high level, I don't know what your listeners are familiar with or what they know, but within the last 10 years or so, there's really been a lot of questioning about established, published research in these peer-reviewed journals. And the core question is, what percentage of the things that are in the journals are actually true? That is, if another research group made an effort to recreate that experiment, would they end up with the same results? Would they have roughly, comparable effect sizes, which is an important component? And really, even more basically, would they obtain what they refer to as a statistically significant effect? That is an effect that is regarded as something above and beyond being simply from chance. So taking a step back from that for a moment, and then, I'm happy to answer or elaborate as you see fit. But taking a step back, I think it's important to recognize there's a difference between, there are people who have committed fraud, right? And those are certainly, there's a lot of high profile cases of that. That's in multiple domains. The president of Stanford was asked to step down because there were some shenanigans, shall we say, in some publications that emerged from his lab. There was recently a professor from Harvard in the business school that was asked to step down because of accusations of explicit fraud. That's been elaborated on and covered by some really great work by guys at Data Colada. But what I'm talking about are not instances of just outright fraud, people making stuff up, but rather biases in the results, maybe some flexibility on the part of the researchers, and psychology as a whole asking, how do we actually get to this position where people are creating research and getting papers published, which actually don't stand, they don't really stand on their own. That is, there's difficulty in replicating them. Effect sizes tend to be smaller. And in many instances, the core effects aren't replicated at all. To situate that a little bit, I mentioned specifically academic psychology. To situate that, it's important to keep in mind that there are piles and piles of PhDs coming out of schools every year. And, a lot of them, people don't go into psychology to say, I'm going to go and hit it big, or I'm going to produce a bunch of garbage results. They go in there with they're talented people. They're genuinely interested in human behavior, thought, language, social relationships, social psychology, et cetera. And then when they get in there, they realize a couple of things. The first is that it is a real meat grinder. It is a ton of work. And at the end of it, if you're lucky, you will have a PhD and you will emerge into a job market that is virtually non-existent. It is not uncommon for job openings at reasonably good schools. I don't mean just, the uber elite schools, but, even just a standard state school, not even necessarily a large one, not even one with a football team and a basketball team. It's not uncommon for a single job opening to have 200, 300, 400 applicants. So I had heard that when I was going back years. I had heard that when I was a graduate student, but it sort of washes over you, right? You sort of already made up your mind you're going to go forth into this thing. And but for the individuals that are even fortunate enough to get those first jobs, suddenly now they're on the clock. They have to get papers published. They have to go through that peer review system. I can talk about that in a little greater depth. They essentially have to fund themselves, which means they have to get grant funding. A disproportion of that grant funding is actually hogged up by older researchers. So there's not a lot of money. There's very few jobs. You got about 5 years to prove your worth. And that creates enormous pressure on those individuals to get some results out that are accepted. And I think that's where you start to get maybe politely referred to as researcher degrees of freedom, which, maybe people will kind of, maybe we drop these cases and add these cases here. I don't think it's done from the perspective of someone being deliberately fraudulent, but you can see how the combination of incentives on the one hand and a real desire to see the thing that in your heart is true, to really see that come out, those two things play together. And what you get is, I think, a fair number of questionable results that end up getting published in the research literature. And that creates problems for the reputation of the field, very reasonably so, as well as for people that come after, because then they're contending with research results that aren't necessarily real. They think they're real. They're trying to replicate the results they can, and they think it's because they're stupid, and it's actually because of something else that occurred in the course of the process.
All right, so you're gonna have to forgive me because I have a degree in econ. Bachelor's only, but
awesome. So if I had to do it again, I probably would have done econ. I would have been like a labor economist. I'd still be in the same broad situation, but I have a love of econ.
You can definitely still be a labor economist, and that's tightly related to my question here. What the heck is happening that people keep entering this, not seeing what you just described on the other end?
Yeah. So I will say this, and I'll speak for myself specifically, and again, being a little bit older, although I don't think things have changed in that, I will speak, I think, for, kind of the collective group. So the first is that I think younger people, and I would have included myself in this, you get to college, you're pretty nerdy, and you see this future, and it seems awfully vague. and you don't really have a sense of where does someone that's really into reading, where does somebody that likes libraries, where does somebody that maybe likes data, like where does that person go? You know, they don't see it mapping onto maybe some of the more traditional paths. You know, I could never have seen myself as an accountant for an example, or, you know, well, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to go to law school, or I'm going to go to medical school. So your notion of what paths are available is limited, and it's not because people are misinforming you. It's just the scope of your experience is fairly limited. Then you get to a university and there's some subset of people, they really like the major. And then who else do they know that really likes this major? The professor, right? And here's somebody that is really into this thing, right? And you say, well, how did you get to do this? And they lay out the path. Well, I graduated from high school when I was 18, and then I finished my undergrad at 22, and then I got into graduate school at 22, and then I finished up when I was 27, and then now I did a postdoc. They didn't really do postdocs very often back then. It's certainly more common now. And they kind of lay out this path, and you think, oh, well, this is kind of nice and neat and tidy. And you look at their life and you don't realize, I mean, it's, you know, what's the survivorship bias, right? It's like the ultimate example of survivorship bias, where you think, oh, this is the path and this could be really great. And you ignore or you excuse that other information that surrounds it, because this is a shining example of what it is that you think you want. Just to add one more thing, I also think that as part of it, up until someone gets into graduate school and even through, this, you know, sort of the scope of people that many graduate students, not all, but many of them interact with, is fairly limited. So you don't necessarily know other people who went on to get a job in X and then change jobs over to do this and that thing and the other, and had these varying career paths and then kind of made it all work out 5, 6, 10 years later. What you see are a bunch of other people that are largely just like you, just as geeky and into your topic, just like you. And you kind of sit around and you all say, woe is me, because I have to get a postdoc and my advisor is X, Y, or Z in some cases, or I need publications and there are no jobs. But it's kind of a pity party, right? It can be. That doesn't mean that they're not talented people. And it doesn't mean that, you know, it was a rotten experience. I had a wonderful experience. I think graduate school was great, but there's just a hard reality of what the job market is that makes it very tough for people to adjust. And that's changed too, right? We were told, well, all these people are going to retire, right? Well, they didn't retire, or they did, and they were replaced by adjuncts, right? So you play that out over time, and it's a combination of ignorance on the part of the students. And I also just think a changing labor market and a changing job market.
See, you're already being a labor economist right there.
Well, I might have served myself well if I had done that a little bit earlier. So
I remember sitting in a medium-sized lecture hall at the liberal arts school that I went to, taking psychology as a gen ed requirement, and it was pretty much just what you described. I mean, it was several hundred people. Probably half of them could see themselves doing what the professor was doing. It was a very likable professor, jovial, deeply engaged in the work. He was holding court every day when we had class, told jokes. Usually they were funny. I remember him telling us that the most important thing is the bookends. So make a good impression at the beginning and then close strong, and then everything else, everybody will forget in the middle. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, I could do that. I know psychology now. And in the same lecture hall, I had an econ professor for a couple different classes. And I remember I was getting close to graduation. I wasn't close with this guy. I wasn't on a first name basis or anything like that. But I talked to him after class, like walking between buildings. And I was like, what do you think I should do for work? I've got this econ degree I'm about to finish. And he goes, I have absolutely no idea. Just don't do this. Whatever you do, don't do what I did.
Yeah, I think the econ guys, I sense, are probably a little bit more direct. It may be, the psych people, they're more people, if you will. And again, I want to be really clear. I think I learned a ton as a graduate student. I went to the University of Iowa. I had wonderful advisors. I learned a ton. My postdoc in Germany was a once in a lifetime opportunity. So from that perspective, I don't regret the path. I would have handled certain aspects of my education differently. I would have focused, at least earlier on, less on domain specific knowledge and gone for more fundamental tools. That, I think especially looking at all the stuff that's come out, especially in light of this replication crisis, there's been much more attention paid to what kinds of statistics people are using, why they're using those statistical methods. Are there other methods that are available? And it turns out actually all along there were. I would have done well to have been more aware of those much earlier on. And so I fault myself for that too. It was a wonderful experience, but I had a professor of mine in graduate school, and he said, just kind of in an offhanded way, he said, what would have gotten you tenure before now won't even get you an interview. Right. And like, I think a rational person would go, oh, I should get out of here. Right. Like, you can be absolutely fabulous. And I wasn't fabulous. I was solid. Right. But you can be absolutely fabulous and still there's no jobs. And then on top of that, even if you get a job, you look around now, I'm married. I've been married for 24 years. I have 3 kids. I was having children in graduate school. You look around, there's no babies. You know what I mean? People thought I was completely crazy. So there were aspects of that life that I think it's just extremely demanding. The payoff is it's really not awesome unless you're really, really into it and you can't see yourself doing anything else. For some people, that's true. I think for most of us, we probably would be equally happy in kind of adjacent areas, and so I would definitely fall into that group.
And you do have a job now.
I do have a job now. Yes. Just quickly on the job front. So after my postdoc ended, I had like exquisitely bad timing. So I graduated from college in 1995. Job market was great. I bopped around a little bit, lived in New York. I taught high school for a year, just trying to figure out a path. I eventually landed at the University of Iowa. And this job market was still really good. Where was I? I was in graduate school. Right. And then I go to a postdoc in Germany, and, it's great. I get to live in Europe, and my daughter was born there, and I worked with just absolutely tremendous people. And then I came out in the job market in 2009 when the entire world has financially blown up. There's no more funding. I had people tell me, you can't come out of the job market now. Well, that's too bad, because I have 3 children, right? And I got to get on it. So I ended up doing research for the Department of the Army. I worked for the U.S. government. I lived in Columbus, Georgia, worked at Fort Benning. Absolutely the best job I could have had coming out, because it really disabused you of the notions that everything that you learned in school is really all matters that much, right? So nobody really cares about your fancy degrees. They're training soldiers, and you better get with it. If you have something that you can provide that can help me, great. Otherwise, get out of the way. And I probably learned more about human behavior and learning and development and expertise and excellence in training in the couple of years that I was there than I did in graduate school. And that's not a slap at graduate school. It's really a testament to the quality of the men and women that I met down there. Navigated to work for a large healthcare company in Louisville doing data science. And then from there, eventually made my way to a small personality assessment company where we use personality insights to lay the foundation for well-being at work. But the real, sort of the broader arching theme there is, let's take these research insights. And then for me throughout the career is to say, all right, how do I actually get to the place where people are doing something with the thing that I think we know, and get rid of a lot of the, kind of the excess stuff. What are the kind of the rules of thumb here that can help us make better decisions at work?
You just mentioned something right there that I want to double click on, and it's in the social sciences, let's say psychology, since that's the area you know best. It's the sort of duality of the esoteric nature of the discipline and the hard science nature of the discipline. What drew you to it initially, and how do you marry those two potentially different worlds now?
It's a great question. So I will say quite openly, I am working diligently in my non-work time. I need some of my work time to beef up my hard sciences background there. So I would say, it's taken me a while to kind of figure out what the recurring themes are. But piecing it back together in retrospect, I was really interested in how it is that people wind up where they do, and how it is that the broader circumstances influence that endpoint. This actually goes back to an experience that I had. I changed schools when I was in 4th grade, and I went to a different school that had a math test to kind of put you on, track A or track B or track C. I did great in the reading section. I got slammed in the math section. I knew I was a good student, and I could not believe that I got slammed that badly in the math section. And then I thought, oh, that's interesting. They expect me to learn something over here, but I hadn't ever learned that. Why was that different? And, I didn't move. I lived in the same decent neighborhoods. What was different about school A school versus school B? So fast forward a little bit, it was really about understanding for me, it was about understanding what's this notion of intelligence? How do we measure it? What are the components that contribute to it? What are the challenges of measuring it? And then from there, it moved into areas like dynamic systems, where you look at a system not as just being this single isolable component, but rather as something that is developing through time, looking at behavior and performance of given tasks as emergent properties. And really, that, I think, for me, kind of, that was the real rigorous structure that I really benefited from in the latter half of graduate school, and certainly in the postdoc. So I think we can ask basic questions in psychology. I think we have very good tools for asking basic questions about child development, about learning, about language, about memory, about thought, cognition, certainly visual cognition, which I think is a really very mature science, auditory perception, et cetera. And then on the back end, it was about pulling all those different things together. Okay, so fine, you have these higher level concepts of emergent systems. So how does that actually work out when you're looking at a sergeant training a bunch of 18-year-olds about how to fire this rifle down range in a short period of time? So for me, I needed the topic, I needed the domain. And then once I had sort of those basic domains, it became a question of what's the best language, if you will, to understand these processes. And I found that networks, complexity, dynamic systems really offered that kind of language that was a marrying of the complex and the rich and the suitably sophisticated, but also really grounded in the fact that people are living, breathing entities, not just computers on sticks.
What was your networks or everything epiphany? What year?
Oh, I don't know that I can pin it down to a specific year. And I would actually say, even within the last few years, I think I've been able to piece together why it is that. So let's take economics as an example. I always like F.A. Hayek, how he discussed, the price system and looking at that as a source of information, and how it is that you need that information to coordinate. To coordinate with different economic behaviors within a market. Over on the other end, the work that I did as a graduate student was focused on what they refer to as spatial language, spatial memory. So, you're sitting there, a dot pops up, dot goes away, you point to where it is you remember it, and what are the sort of the underlying dynamics of that, and then connecting that with language. But actually, as it turns out, the work that my advisors and my postdoc advisors did, they would couch those spatial language and spatial memory components actually within this broader framework of neural dynamic systems, looking at explicit models of interplay of neural activity, how those things played together. And it really wasn't until a couple of years later that I realized Hayek and dynamic systems and networks and emergent behavior, that all those things, they were all kind of one of a piece. I had interests in Hayek and I had interests in dynamic systems, but there was just something, whether it was, focus or lack of focus, I should say, or I saw these disparate pieces, and it was really only, let's say, in the last, I'd say maybe the 10 years or 5 years that I finally go, oh, this is why I'm interested in these 5 or 6 different pieces.
I mean, that's okay. We're all chasing the singularity where everything becomes one gigantic computer model or ontology or something like that.
Yeah,
we're all just a slave
yeah.
to this abstract model that was lurking in all of our collective consciousness anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's
is
funny.
That too out there? Am I ruining this?
No, you're not. I don't think so. And I will say, for me, would that I, in whatever way that I'm able to piece it together, and I don't even have to make a novel contribution to anything, right? I'm just like, let me just understand how what's already out there, how those things are connected. And okay, it would have been great if I had figured this out when I was 18 or 20, 30, whatever, but I didn't. But that's okay. I'm here, I'm making progress. That's the direction that I'm gonna continue to plow. At least I feel like I've been able to answer some questions for myself about, all right, I've been digging around in the same space. It didn't really have a name. I mean, even the notion of dynamical systems, if you will, back, as an undergrad, like, people just weren't talking about that, right? It wasn't kind of in the air. No, I take responsibility for that. I could have dug around a lot more. Or maybe I should have spent more time doing things in chemistry or physics or economics or something. So it might have been there to discover, but whatever it was, I really was constantly searching for it. Now I think I've landed in the domain. I see the connections between things at whatever level, and I'm looking to extend that level.
What was one theory and this is how this goes. Like, we meant to talk about statistics and data and reproducibility, and that ship sailed a long time ago. We're on to other things now. But what is one thing, either a theory, a concept, or something you learned in psychology that was counterintuitive, and you understand your existence a certain way, but you learned something and it was counterintuitive to the world that as you understood it? Is there one thing that you can point to?
I don't know if it was necessarily counterintuitive, but it took a while for me to get my head wrapped around it. So it was understanding that in complex systems, you can't really isolate a cause or an effect, right? That you can look at a behavior, you can see an outcome, but you can't map sort of one-to-one, well, this input came in and this input came out. There was so much of the language around, and I think that the language of networks now people are much more familiar with. It's in the news, just certainly even something like social networks, like a lot of people around them. This is a common thing. You go back, 20, 30 years, people were not necessarily talking about network theory. They were in sort of corners of academia maybe, but it wasn't something that had come to the fore. And then, you started to see, from my experience, you started to see in psychology these basic neural networks, and they were able to create systematic law-like outputs, but without
interpretability.
It was like, in other words, the answer was sort of among the nodes. It was distributed, right? And that you could have this emergent outcome that we as interpreters could see, well, clearly it's quote following a rule, but it wasn't a formal rule-based system. And you saw this in neural networks, and I saw it again in the kinds of models that we did for spatial memory. You couldn't say, well, this part does this. It was looking at emergent behaviors across the whole system. And that then also, to me, really opened my eyes to, I think, the limits of a lot of work in neuroscience, where even to this day, people will try to point, well, this part of the brain does this and this part of the brain does that. Well, it's really not that. It's not really quite that simple, right? That doesn't mean that there isn't some degree of specialization. It doesn't mean that certain parts of the brain don't have a particularly large impact on a certain kind of behavior. But at the same time, what do you have in the brain? You have parallel systems and you have serial systems. You have feed forward. You have reentrant networks. It's really messy, and that makes it really exciting, but it makes it really hard. And I think the field, neuroscience, psychology, and I think other fields as well, they've basically been forced to say, look, it's a heck of a lot more complicated than we thought. We can't just say this part of the brain does this and this part of the brain does that. The brain is really not like a computer in the kind of, laptop sense. It is computing, but it's computing based on a much richer, emergent, very complicated, very obviously biologically grounded system in ways that we hadn't really the language of the mathematical language to appreciate before. So that was a long-winded answer, like a lot of my answers, Terry. So my apologies.
Is there a contingent particularly a contingent of social scientists that yearns for the days when Terry takes a weird metal rod through the right side of his face, and then the left side stops working, and they're like, "Oh, well, this is what we expected.
This is interesting. Yeah, let's see what happens." Yeah, I mean, it's funny. You cannot go to a textbook and not come across the Phineas Gage example, right?
There's his name. He's
got
a great. He's part of it.
He's got
a great name though.
He
if he didn't have a great name, it would be tough.
Yeah, it would. And I had the good fortune of having a class with some folks that in a lab in Iowa that actually did a lot of work that looked at particular regions of the brain, looked at neural injuries, whether because of stroke or other particular causes, and we're able to, I think, find some really deep meanings specifically around the relationship between emotion in the body on the one hand and decision making on the other. So I'm going to do a little bit of a botched summary here, but the long and the short of it is that I think had often tended to think, we think about thinking as this abstract thing. Thinking is chess, it's logic, and we make good decisions based on logic. And then what you find, particularly with this group at Iowa, they find that when individuals are making decisions for which they cannot effectively pull in sort of emotional reactions, emotional processing, they end up actually making really bad decisions. And so they would have what they call the Iowa gambling task, where individuals would, they would decide to bet or not bet, and there'd be certain patterns of cards that lent themselves to having a positive outcome or a negative outcome. And they would find that individuals in these experiments who made right decisions, they couldn't identify the pattern. They couldn't name it. It wasn't like they had, quote, figured it out, but they would actually have this physiological response. You could, they would do like galvanic skin reactions and maybe some other measures, but they would actually see that there was this sort of emotional recognition that something bad is about to happen, and those individuals would bet less. For other groups that, again, had these neural injuries, there was no such physiological response, and this really highlighted this strong marriage between thinking and intelligence and behavior on the one hand, and emotion on the other. We kind of tend to poo-poo emotion. Oh, it's a lizard brain. No. Like, this is an integrated system, man. We really need to take seriously the whole system, how all these components are integrated. And I would also highlight, we think people are pretty cool, right? Like, we can do some pretty amazing things, but this thin little layer of cortex, that's the experiment, right? That, like, nature's still not entirely sure. We've been only hanging out for a couple million years, depending on, plus or minus, depending on, what you regard as human beings proper. The lizard brain, that thing is tried and true, man. Right. That's the thing that more or less I'm summarizing, roughly, but these animals are starting with that. We're going to leave heart rate. We're going to leave that up to the stuff that the higher brain can't touch. We're going to leave breathing. We're going to leave, the liver and the kidneys and digestion. We're going to leave all that stuff outside of the higher level things. We're going to kind of tweak on the edges and you end up with us. But I think we need to have a little bit more respect for the sort of the underlying foundational systems and recognize that what we have is not just this nice thing placed on top, but it's rather something that has evolved in concert with those, quote, lower level processes. But it's evolved to be, exquisitely tied into them. And that really is a critical part of understanding human behavior.
Are there any vestigial parts of the brain, like the appendix of the brain?
I don't know that answer. I'm going to say no, but that's not an informed no. And it's my understanding that, like, apparently there's a new theory. And again, I'm speaking super roughly here, like way out of my basis of knowledge now, but that there is some suggestion that they think the appendix actually might store bacteria that are helpful to sort of kickstarting digestive processes in the digestive tract. So the appendix might not quite be as useless as people thought.
Yeah, rock star superhero music producer Rick Rubin, who has a similar beard to you, actually had his appendix. The doctors told him he needed his appendix removed, and he said, "I don't think so. That's part of my body. It's staying in." And he turned out fine. And then he wrote about it in his book.
I like Rick Rubin. I'll have to look up that story. I like Rick Rubin because I mean, among other things, I found out that at some point in one of his interviews, he mentions that he's jogging along the beach with Laird Hamilton, who's like the world's greatest surfer, and Chris Chelios, who played hockey for like 30 years and was on the Blackhawks. I grew up outside of Chicago, so I love Chris Chelios. I'm like, wait, what? Rick Rubin is jogging on the beach with Laird Hamilton and Chris Chelios. What planet am I on?
What planet is he on? That's the question.
I don't know, but he's doing pretty well for himself.
So my last question, and I'm going to ask for you to make this is a definitive decision that, John, it's an edict you're going to send out to all of the social sciences. Should linear metrics be banned from social science studies?
No. I don't think they should be. Do I have to elaborate, or can I just leave it at no?
I'm curious to get your take.
Yeah, I'm not a statistician, so if I'm allowed to come back, I will elaborate on this. But I think it's hard. I think just hard at base level, it's hard to get first order relationships. It's hard to just get first order approximations of what's related to what. So I think those kinds of linear statistics have some core basic use, just in terms of let's call it, exploratory research. So I think that's important. But to your point, I will also say I had an advisor years ago that was sort of bemoaning the use of linear regression, et cetera, saying, why are we using linear approaches to understand a nonlinear world. And I think that that is actually that is a deep truth. So I wouldn't ban it. But I would say is that we need a more rigorous approach to complicated behavior. And the challenge with that, just to kind of, bring it all around, the challenge with that is that it's harder, right? Even doing something like a Bayesian approach, it's a big pain in the butt, right? And so we have researchers that are under enormous time pressure, they're under career pressure, they're making squat. And then you're going to tell them, oh, by the way, you need to take this different approach to statistics, which, by the way, we didn't really prepare you for, right? That's not to make an excuse for them, but I think that there's a cost to doing things in the more complex but the right way. And currently we have a system that does not lend itself to the kind of deep reflection and thought and collaboration that a domain as complicated as human behavior and specifically psychology demands. So don't ban it. Meet with the theorists. Let's bone up on the math. Let's accept our ignorance a little bit, and let's really start to dig in a way that's systematically and theoretically sound. And I think if we did that approach, we would rely a lot less on sort of basic linear regression, and we would actually start to build models, dynamic systems models, neurally grounded models that really captured that sort of the time by time components of human behavior. So I think it's a vestige of lack of math, and I think it's a vestige of a lack of sort of theoretical complexity.
John, we're a young podcast. I was hoping to rush to the microphone tomorrow and say, John Lipinski, PhD, says linear metrics should be banned from social sciences.
I can't do that. I don't know. Yeah, darn. My failure. I guess that's one of the many ways in which I ignore social cues or obvious opportunities to capitalize on what's going on in the greater social world.
Russ, I yield the floor to you.
Man, I learned a lot.
I did too.
I think I have miles to go, but I learned a lot. Thanks for helping us explore the edge of expertise and also ask you questions that may or may not have actually been anywhere near your wheelhouse, and being a good sport about those ones.
No, I appreciate it. This is a great opportunity. Thank you both very much.
Awesome. Thank you, John.